The sound came first. Not the shout, not the scuffle, not the creak of a car door being wrenched open. The sound that stopped Jefferson Boulevard on a Wednesday afternoon in late July was the slap itself, sharp and flat and ugly, cracking through the humid air like a branch snapping underfoot in a dead quiet forest. The kind of sound that doesn't belong in the middle of a city street, the kind of sound that makes strangers freeze mid-step and turn toward it before their minds have fully registered what they just heard. Officer Kyle Brannon stepped back from the elderly man and adjusted his duty belt with the casual and unhurried satisfaction of someone who has just finished a task and is ready to move on to the next one. He smoothed the front of his uniform shirt. He let a slow smirk settle across his pink, thick-jawed face. In his mind, the math was simple, and the transaction was complete. He had asserted his authority. The old man had been reminded of his place, and now the paperwork would take care of the rest. What Brannon did not notice, because Brannon had never in his career cultivated the habit of noticing things that didn't serve him, was the way the elderly man responded to the blow. He did not crumple. He did not make a sound. He simply absorbed the force of the strike, let his head turn with it, and then with a slowness that was entirely deliberate, turned his face back toward the officer who had hit him. The look in his eyes was not fear. It was not rage. It was something far more unsettling, a kind of quiet, piercing, almost sorrowful pity. The expression of a man who has lived long enough to recognize a particular kind of fool on sight, and who understands with complete certainty exactly how this is going to end. Brannon mistook it for submission. He would spend the next several years of his life understanding exactly how wrong he was. He had just made the worst mistake of his career. He just didn't know it yet. Clarence Doyle was a man who had made peace with the world on his own terms, not because the world had been kind to him, but because he had decided somewhere around his 45th year that bitterness was a weight he refused to carry for people who weren't worth the effort. He was 72 years old, and he wore those years the way a good piece of furniture wears its age, with visible history, with dignity, with a solidity that made younger things look flimsy by comparison. His face was deeply lined around the eyes, not from worry, but from decades of squinting into sunlight on his mail route, 34 years carrying the same streets of the same city for the United States Postal Service, rain and ice and August heat, and all of it every day without complaint, because the work was honest and the work was his, and that had always been enough. His 1997 Buick LeSabre was immaculate. Not new, the odometer had crossed 180,000 miles 4 summers ago, but loved in the way that men of Clarence's generation loved the things they owned, which meant maintained religiously polished every Sunday morning after church. Before the day got away from him, the interior smelling faintly of cedar from the small blocks he kept tucked under the seats. He had bought the car with cash, a fact he had mentioned exactly once to his son, and never again, because it wasn't something that needed to be said more than once. On this particular Wednesday afternoon, Clarence was wearing a pressed cream-colored linen shirt, khaki slacks with a sharp crease, and his wire-rimmed glasses, the ones his daughter Renee had picked out for him 2 Christmases ago, holding them up in the optometrist's shop and saying, "Dad, these make you look distinguished," and Clarence saying, "I am distinguished," and both of them laughing in the easy way of people who have known each other long enough to love without effort. He was on his way to pick up his weekly prescription at the pharmacy on Clement Street, a 20-minute errand that he had made every Wednesday for the past 2 years, since his cardiologist put him on the blood pressure medication. It was an ordinary afternoon. The jazz station was playing something cool and unhurried through the Buick speakers. The summer light was thick and golden on the pavement. Before he pulled out of his driveway that morning, as he did before every drive, Clarence had placed both hands on the wheel at 10 and 2 and held them there for a moment before putting the car in gear. It was a habit he had developed in 1971 at the age of 22 after a particular encounter on a road in Georgia that he had never fully described to anyone, and it was a habit he had passed on to every man in his family who came after him, to his son, to his nephews, to his son-in-law, not as a rule, but as a piece of necessary knowledge, the kind that you hope your children never need, but teach them anyway, because the world does not always announce itself before it arrives. Clarence Doyle was not a naive man. He had lived through things that would have permanently bent younger people into different shapes. But he had chosen deliberately and repeatedly and at considerable personal cost to respond to the world's cruelty, not with matching cruelty, but with the kind of immovable, dignified calm that is its own form of power, quiet, patient, and ultimately far more durable than rage. He was simply going to pick up his prescription. He would be home before 4. Officer Kyle Brannon had been on the force for 8 years, which was long enough to have developed habits and not long enough to have developed wisdom, a combination that tends to produce a particular and dangerous kind of officer. He was 36 years old, pink-faced and thick-necked, with the physical presence of a man who had been athletic in his early 20s and had let that athleticism curdle into something heavier and less disciplined over the years, though he still carried himself with the exaggerated uprightness of someone performing authority, rather than embodying it. 3 months earlier, he had been passed over for a promotion he had been certain was his, and he had not recovered from that in any meaningful way. He carried the humiliation of it like a splinter, embedded just below the surface of everything. He did not always visible, but always there, always inflaming. Brannon did not patrol in the way the department's use of force manual described patrolling. He hunted. He was good at it in the narrow way that people are good at things they have no business doing, practiced, instinctive, efficient. And what he hunted specifically and deliberately were people he had calculated could not effectively fight back. The elderly, the isolated, people without legal resources, without connections, without the particular combination of knowledge and confidence required to hold their ground against a badge. He had been doing this for years, and because the complaints had been routed through a department that protected its own with the quiet, reflexive loyalty of a closed system, nothing had ever fully stuck. He was working a side street off Jefferson when he spotted the Buick moving steadily in the lane ahead of him. Clean, classic, deliberate, and something about the sight of it snagged in his chest in a way that he would not have been able to articulate clearly, but that amounted at its core to resentment. A well-dressed elderly black man in a well-maintained car on a Wednesday afternoon. The picture didn't fit the categories Brannon had built his career around sorting people into. He watched for 11 seconds. The Buick was driving at exactly the speed limit, both hands visible on the wheel. Brannon hit the lights anyway, and the justification arrived in his mind a half-second later, smooth and practiced and completely fabricated, drifted over the center line. He had told that particular lie so many times it no longer felt like one. Clarence saw the lights in his rearview mirror and felt the familiar tightening in his chest. Not panic, not surprise, but the specific, exhausting weight of a feeling he had carried for 50 years, the feeling of a man who knows he has done nothing wrong, and also knows that this knowledge offers him only partial protection in the world as it actually exists. He pulled over immediately, precisely into a marked parking zone on the right side of Jefferson Boulevard, rolled the car to a smooth stop, cut the engine, and placed both hands back at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel before Officer Brannon had even opened his cruiser door. The window was already rolled down. Clarence sat perfectly still and waited. Brannon's approach was slow and deliberate, in the particular way of someone who understands that making a person wait is its own kind of control. He took his time crossing the distance between the vehicles, his right hand resting on the butt of his holstered sidearm. In that posture that the department's training manual explicitly discourages in non-threatening traffic stops, and that Brannon used anyway, because it established the visual hierarchy he preferred. He stopped just behind the driver's doorframe, forcing Clarence to rotate his neck at an uncomfortable angle to look up at him. Another tactic, one so small and so deliberate that most people don't recognize it for what it is. Clarence recognized it immediately. He gave his name. He stated his address. He narrated each movement before he made it. "I'm going to reach into the glove compartment for my registration now, officer," with the careful precision of a man who has been performing this particular choreography for half a century and understands that the performance is not optional. When Brannon demanded license registration and proof of insurance without a greeting, and without stating a reason, Clarence asked politely and directly what he had been pulled over for. Brannon's answer drifted over the center line, and "your left tail light's been flickering" was delivered with the easy confidence of a complete fabrication, accompanied by a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes, and a follow-up observation muttered, rather than said, that Clarence heard clearly. "You people always have something to say." Clarence paused. He looked at Brannon for a moment, not with anger, but with the level, steady gaze of a man deciding how to respond to something that does not deserve his full emotional engagement. He handed over the documents without another word, his hands completely steady. Brannon studied the paperwork with theatrical attention, clearly looking for something wrong, clearly finding nothing wrong, and clearly becoming more irritable with each passing second that the documents remained perfectly in order, because a man who has already decided on the outcome of an encounter does not respond well to evidence that undermines it. He shoved the papers back through the window with a flick of his wrist that scattered them across Clarence's lap, then ordered him out of the vehicle. Clarence, his documents still scattered across his lap, looked up at Brannon calmly and stated his circumstances with the measured clarity of a man who has spent a lifetime communicating with people who were not listening. He was 72 years old. He had arthritis in both knees, and he was happy to receive whatever citation the officer intended to write while seated in his vehicle, which was his legal right during a routine traffic stop. Brannon's response to this was to reach past Clarence's shoulder, grab the door handle, and yank the heavy door open with enough force that the hinge made a grinding protest, the sound of metal being stressed past its comfortable range of motion. A small violence that preceded the larger one. He took hold of Clarence's shoulder, his left hand closing around the pressed cream linen of Clarence's shirt, and hauled him sideways out of the seat with a force that was entirely disproportionate to the situation, and entirely consistent with the way Kyle Brannon operated when he had decided that a person needed to be reminded of something. Clarence's feet hit the pavement and his knees buckled. Not completely, not enough to put him on the ground, but enough that he had to grab the car frame with both hands to steady himself, his arthritic fingers closing around the hot metal of the door jamb, while the blood pressure medication he was on its way to pick up pulsed a reminder through his body that he was not in fact a young man anymore. He straightened. He turned to face Brannon. He requested formally and explicitly to speak with Brannon's shift supervisor, the precise language that officers are required to honor a request that functions as a small legal tripwire in interactions exactly like this one. The request landed on Kyle Brannon like a match on dry paper. His face went from pink to a deep mottled red in a matter of seconds, the color of a man whose ego has been directly addressed and found insufficient to the moment, and what came out of him next was not the measured language of a law enforcement professional, but the raw, cornered fury of someone who has been defied by a person he had already decided did not have the standing to defy him. It happened without warning, which is how it almost always happens. Not building to a visible crest, but simply arriving the way bad things do when they are committed by people who have stopped performing even the minimal theater of restraint. Brannon pulled his right hand back and brought it across Clarence's face in an open-handed strike that snapped the old man's head to the side with a force that was calculated in the way of all cruelties that have been practiced long enough to become efficient, to humiliate rather than to incapacitate. The sound of it, flat, sharp, obscene in its clarity, traveled across Jefferson Boulevard and arrived in the ears of everyone within half a block before any of them had fully processed what they were seeing. The physical accounting came in sequence: the impact across Clarence's left cheek, the involuntary rotation of his neck with the blow, the metallic flood of blood against his inner lip where his teeth caught the soft tissue, the high ringing in his left ear, and the sudden clarity, sharp and cold and entirely focused, that settled over him in the seconds immediately following the kind of clarity that comes not from adrenaline, but from the absolute absence of surprise from having known at some level that this particular world contained men like this, and that this particular afternoon had just confirmed it. His wire-rimmed glasses, Renee's Christmas gift, the ones that made him look distinguished, flew from his face and hit the pavement with a small heartbreaking clatter, sliding 3 feet across the hot asphalt before coming to rest against the curb. Across Jefferson Boulevard, at a small cafe table outside the Morning Cup, a 22-year-old pre-nursing student named Danielle Webb had her phone out. She had started filming the moment she saw the car door being wrenched open. Something about the way Brannon moved had registered with the part of her brain that recognized danger before the rest of her caught up, and her camera was running steady and clear and mercilessly comprehensive, capturing everything from the narrated glove compartment, reach to the supervisor request, to the slap itself in high-definition video with audio clean enough to hear Clarence's exact words. Clarence turned his head back from the force of the blow, slowly and deliberately, and looked at Officer Kyle Brannon. The blood was pooling at the corner of his mouth. His cheek was already beginning to color, and the expression on his face, calm, clear, carrying a weight of pity that had nothing to do with weakness, made Brannon take a half-step backward before he had consciously decided to move. "You are a very foolish young man," Clarence said. His voice was quiet. It was completely steady. "And you have made a terrible mistake today." Brannon's response was to turn to the gathering crowd and announce loudly and with practiced conviction that Clarence had been resisting arrest and had struck a police officer, a performance so divorced from what the surrounding witnesses had just observed that several people pulled out their own phones. He spun Clarence around, pressed the elderly man's chest against the hot metal of the car, and forced his wrists into handcuffs that he tightened a notch past necessity. A small, petty cruelty that cost him nothing and gave him the particular satisfaction he had always derived from absolute control over people who could not stop him. As Brannon narrated a fictional version of events into his radio, Clarence caught the eye of Danielle Webb across the street. She was still filming. He gave her the smallest possible nod, barely a movement at all, and then looked forward and said nothing more. The truth was already on its way. He just had to endure the indignity of the night. The booking desk of the Central Precinct smelled, as it always did at 7 in the evening, of industrial floor cleaner and old coffee and the particular human exhaustion that accumulated in rooms where bad days were officially processed into paperwork. Sergeant Frank Dobbins, 52 years old, with a graying mustache and the eyes of a man who had been doing this job long enough to stop expecting it to surprise him, looked up from a stack of arrest reports when Brannon pushed Clarence through the door. Brannon's report to the desk was smooth, fluent, and entirely fabricated, delivered with the casual confidence of a man who has done this before and has no particular reason to believe this time will be different. Combative during a traffic stop, refused to comply, swung at the officer, required physical subduing. The charges were the full slate assault on a law enforcement officer resisting arrest, failure to comply with a lawful order. He leaned against the counter with his hip while Dobbins wrote, performing the relaxed aftermath of a hard-won arrest, already half thinking about dinner. Dobbins wrote. He did not initially look up, and then, because 30 years of processing human beings through this particular room had given him an instinct that he could not always name, but had learned to trust. He did look up, and what he saw was a 72-year-old man standing in front of his booking desk with a bruise blooming the color of a storm cloud across his left cheek, his shirt still bearing the shoulder wrinkle from where he had been grabbed. His posture exactly as straight as it had been when he walked through the door. His eyes completely calm, and absolutely none of the behavioral signatures that Dobbins associated with people who had actually assaulted a police officer. Something sat wrong. He said nothing. Clarence narrated his own account quietly, without drama, directly addressing Dobbins rather than Brannon. And Brannon interrupted him and was told to let the prisoner speak, and Brannon did not love being told that. But he was on his own ground here, and he knew it, and so he poured himself a cup of stale precinct coffee and waited while the machine moved through its motions. The cuffs, Dobbins noted, were a notch too tight. He loosened them before processing continued. He didn't say anything about it. He wrote it down. Clarence was placed in a holding cell. His blood pressure medication, the prescription he had been on his way to pick up when Officer Brannon had decided that his afternoon needed to be destroyed, was not transferred with him. He asked once politely, and was told that personal medications required a medical intake form that would need to be processed in the morning. He said thank you and sat down on the concrete bench. The holding cell at Central was not designed for comfort or dignity, or the preservation of anything particularly human. It was designed for containment, and it accomplished that function with the minimum possible investment in everything else. The fluorescent light overhead buzzed at a frequency that seemed calculated to prevent sleep. The concrete bench was the temperature of the building's indifference. The smell of industrial cleaner had faded to something underneath it older and less identifiable. Clarence sat on the bench with his back straight and his hands resting on his knees. His bare face, the glasses, were still on the pavement on Jefferson Boulevard, or in an evidence bag somewhere he didn't know which, looking slightly blurred at the edges of his vision in the way the world looked when the careful correction of wire rim lenses was suddenly absent. He was not afraid. This surprised him slightly in a detached observational way, not because fear would have been unreasonable, but because he had half expected it and had instead found something much quieter and much more useful, which was clarity. He was thinking methodically, organizing what he knew and what he could verify and what the morning was going to require of him, and the thinking had the clean, deliberate quality of a mind that has practiced not being derailed by the emotional weather of a situation. The other man in the cell. Marcus, he said his name was early 30s, broad-shouldered, currently detained on a minor non-violent charge that he described with the weary brevity of someone who had been through the intake process before. Watched the old man for a long time in silence with the particular attention of someone who cannot figure out what they're looking at. Eventually, he asked, why wasn't Clarence losing his mind right now? Why wasn't he pacing or demanding or doing any of the things that people did in this room when the walls were closing in? Clarence was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously rather than deflecting it. Then he said something along the lines of having lived long enough to understand that the truth didn't need your panic. It just needed your patience. That the ones who needed to find out about this were going to find out, and that there was nothing he could do in this room tonight that would make that happen faster or better. And so the only sensible thing was to be still and let the morning come. Marcus didn't say anything after that. He sat back against the wall, and after a while he was quiet in a different way than he had been before. A more thoughtful quiet, the quiet of someone who has been given something to consider. Clarence did not make a phone call. He had the right to one, and he chose not to use it, not because he doubted that anyone would come, but because he knew with the bone-deep certainty of a man who has raised someone from nothing that his son would already know. The video would have found him. The video always found the people it was meant to find. And when Darius found it, and he would because Darius never missed anything that touched his father, the response would not be a frantic phone call to a holding cell. It would be 4 hours of driving through the dark with a cold cup of coffee and a mind working through every legal mechanism available, arriving not to comfort but to dismantle. Clarence closed his eyes, not in defeat and not in exhaustion, but in the deliberate, practiced stillness of a man who has learned over 72 years of a life that has asked a great deal of him to trust that the arc bends. Slowly, sometimes agonizingly, but it bends. The fluorescent light buzzed. The city moved outside the walls. He waited. The municipal courtroom on Hayden Street smelled of floor wax and the specific anxious sweat that accumulated in rooms where people came to receive bad news that had already been decided. Judge Harold Sims, 61, with the jowls and the reading glasses and the bench manner of a man who had presided over thousands of arraignments and had long since stopped treating them as events that required his full intellectual engagement, shuffled papers and waited for the morning docket to begin moving. Clarence was brought in from the holding area at 8:40. He was wearing an orange jumpsuit that was slightly too large for him, his wrists cuffed in front of his body, and the bruise on his left cheek had fully established itself overnight into a deep, authoritative purple that was impossible to look at and immediately dismiss. He walked in with his back straight and his chin level, and he stood at the defense table with the posture of a man who is not performing dignity, but simply cannot locate any other way to hold himself. Public defender, Ivan Castillo, 38, was juggling 43 active cases on a Tuesday or Wednesday or whatever day this was. The days having begun to blur into each other, sometime in March, and she had approximately 3 minutes of preparation on Clarence's file before she leaned toward him at the defense table and told him as clearly and efficiently as she could what the math looked like. The ADA was offering a plea, misdemeanor disorderly conduct. The assault charge dropped 6 months probation, no jail time beyond last night. If he refused and went to trial, the officer's sworn affidavit was the primary document, and without evidence, and she had found no evidence yet, the odds were not what she would like them to be. Clarence looked at her calmly and said he would not plead guilty to something he didn't do. That he had not resisted, had not struck anyone, and that the officer had hit him without provocation, and that he understood the position she was describing, but that the position did not change the truth. Yvonne rubbed her temples. She believed him. She also knew that believing him was not in this room the operative variable. Officer Kyle Brannon was sitting in the second row of the gallery in an ill-fitting gray suit that had probably fit him better. 3 years and 15 pounds ago, and he was saying something to his union representative, a large man named Gary Stoltz. And whatever he was saying was apparently amusing, because both of them were laughing quietly, but visibly, in the relaxed way of people who are entirely comfortable with how things are about to go. Brannon looked up once at the defense table, made brief eye contact with Clarence, and looked away again with an expression of complete and comfortable contempt.
Yes.
Ada. Patrick Coyle, 29 and career-hungry, stood to recite the charges in the practiced, confident rhythm of a man who intends to be somewhere considerably more prestigious than this in 5 years, and considers every easy win a brick in that particular road. He laid out Officer Brannon's sworn affidavit, the highly aggressive suspect, the refusal to exit the vehicle, the closed fist swung at the officer, the necessary physical subduing. Judge Sims peered down over his reading glasses at Clarence's bruised face with the weary condescension of a man whose worldview had not been seriously challenged in quite some time. "Mr. Doyle," he began, in the tone of a man preparing to advise someone about the consequences of their own poor choices at your age. The double doors at the back of the courtroom opened. They opened without being slammed. No theatrical force, no announcement. Just the quiet authority of doors that were always going to open at this moment, swinging wide on their hinges as if the building itself had been waiting, and the man who walked through them did so at a pace that was entirely unhurried, and somehow because of that unhurriedness more commanding than any urgency could have managed. Special Agent Darius Doyle was 42 years old and 6 feet 2 inches tall, and he was wearing a charcoal gray suit that had been tailored to his measurements and pressed within the last several hours. And he moved through the center aisle of that courtroom, the way that people move when they have spent 20 years walking into rooms where everything is about to change, with the settled, absolute quality of someone who has already done the hardest part of the work and has arrived to collect what the work has earned. He walked past the gallery benches. He walked past Kyle Brannon, who registered his approach, and something in the back of Brannon's brain fired a warning signal that his conscious mind was not yet fast enough to interpret. He walked straight through the wooden partition dividing the public gallery from the court itself, which was not something members of the public were permitted to do. And the bailiff, a broad, experienced man named Officer Terrell Hayes, who had seen a great many things in his years of courtroom service, stepped forward with his hand moving toward his belt and told the man to stop and state his business. Darius did not stop. He reached into the interior breast pocket of his suit jacket in a motion so smooth and practiced it could have been choreographed, withdrew a leather credential case and let it fall open. The golden seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation caught the overhead fluorescent light and held it. "Special Agent Darius Doyle," he said. Federal Bureau of Investigation. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. It had the quality of something that fills a room not through volume but through weight, and the room, which had been moving through the practiced rhythms of a municipal arraignment, went completely still. He stepped to the defense table and placed his hand on his father's shoulder, his left hand deliberate and gentle on the orange fabric of Clarence's jumpsuit, in a gesture that said without words everything that needed to be said between them. "I'm here. You held. I've got it from here." Then he raised his eyes to Judge Harold Sims and stated with the unhurried precision of a man reading from a document he has already memorized that he was a licensed attorney in this state, having passed the bar examination before joining the bureau, that the paperwork formalizing his appearance as primary counsel had been filed with the court clerk 9 minutes ago, and that he was here to represent his father. The gallery produced a sound, a collective involuntary intake and release of breath that wasn't quite a gasp and wasn't quite silence, but was something in between the sound of a room recalibrating, and in the second row, Kyle Brannon felt something cold and specific move through his chest. Washington. He had thought the old man's name was Doyle. He had not connected the names until this moment. The math landed on him all at once, and it did not add up to anything good. The first image Darius Doyle could recall with complete clarity, clearer than any memory from law school or Quantico or the field, clearer than anything he had earned or built or proven, was a Wednesday evening in the fall of his 9th year, sitting in the back seat of his father's car on a 2-lane road outside the city. Watching the moment, a police cruiser's lights appeared in the rearview mirror, and Clarence Doyle's hands, without any visible moment of decision, moved to 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. "Keep your hands where they can see them, son," his father had said, his voice carrying no panic and no particular urgency, just the measured, unadorned quality of a man transmitting necessary information. "Not because you did anything wrong, because we can't afford for them to be afraid of us." Darius had been 9 years old. He had not fully understood all of it, but he had understood enough. He had understood that his father was describing a world where the arithmetic of safety worked differently for them than it did for other people, and that this was not a complaint or a theory, but simply a fact that had to be accounted for and prepared for the same way you prepared for weather or traffic or any other condition of the world as it actually existed. He had carried that understanding with him through the rest of his childhood, and through high school, and through 3 years of law school at the top of his class at a state university whose scholarship committee had taken a chance on a first-generation student with a 3.97 GPA and a personal essay about his father's hands on a steering wheel. He had carried it through the bar exam and through the first 3 years of private practice, and through the decision at 31 to close his practice and apply to the FBI, a decision that confused a lot of people who thought he was throwing something away, and that made complete sense to him, because the law in private practice fixed individual situations, and the law in federal service could reach into the machinery itself and change how it operated. That was what he wanted, not case by case, the machinery. He had been assigned to the FBI's Civil Rights Division at 34. And he had been good at it in the particular way of people who were doing the thing they were always going to end up doing, efficient, relentless, and carrying a deep personal understanding of the material that no training program can manufacture. 7 months ago, he had quietly opened a federal investigation into the Central Precinct, based on a statistical pattern of use-of-force complaints that had been routed through the department's internal review process, and had disappeared there with a consistency that the data could not explain innocently. Kyle Brannon had been a named subject in that investigation for 4 months. Darius had been building carefully, methodically, the way you build something meant to hold. The phone call had come at 11:17 the previous night, not from Clarence, who had not called anyone, but from a neighbor who had seen Danielle Webb's video, which by that point had been viewed 340,000 times, and was climbing. Darius had watched it twice, standing in his kitchen in Washington, D.C., with the overhead light on, and everything else very quiet, and what had passed through him as he watched was not the jagged hot thing that ordinary people might expect, but rather something older and more complete, a kind of crystalline total clarity, the feeling of a thing that has been building for a long time arriving at its natural conclusion. He had been in his car within 20 minutes. The drive was 4 hours. The coffee went cold before he hit the interstate. He did not turn on the radio. He thought through every legal mechanism available to him with the systematic focus of someone who has rehearsed this particular scenario in one form or another, since he was 9 years old, sitting in a back seat watching his father's hands. He arrived not as a grieving son, though he was a son, and the grief was there underneath. Everything cold and quiet, and his. But as a federal agent who happened to love his father more than he loved anything else on the planet, and he had long since learned that these two things did not conflict. They amplified each other. They always had. Darius addressed the court in 4 precise escalating movements, each one delivered at the same unhurried pace, each one landing with a weight that the one before it had prepared the room to receive. The first was procedural and complete. He was licensed to practice law. In this state, the appearance paperwork was filed, the public defender was relieved, and the plea offer from the ADA was formally rejected on behalf of his client, who maintained his complete innocence and would not be entering any plea of guilt to any charge arising from this incident. Judge Sims began to arrange his face into the expression of a man preparing to explain jurisdictional limitations to an over-eager federal agent, and Darius did not give him the time to complete the arrangement. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a silver flash drive, which he held up at a height and angle that the entire courtroom could observe, and stated that the previous evening, his office had received a complete, unedited high-definition video from an independent witness named Danielle Webb, captured on her personal device from across Jefferson Boulevard, with clear audio throughout documenting the entirety of the stop from the moment Clarence's car was pulled over to the moment the handcuffs were applied. In the second row of the gallery, Kyle Brannon's right hand found the armrest of the bench and closed around it, the knuckles going white under the pressure of a grip he was not consciously controlling. Next to him, Gary Stoltz, who had been a union representative long enough to recognize the specific kind of silence that precedes an institutional collapse, shifted slightly in his seat, creating a few inches of physical distance between himself and his client that was not large enough to be called deliberate, and was entirely deliberate. The second strike, Darius stated what the video showed: a 72-year-old man complying completely with every request. His narrated movements, his hands at 10 and 2, his polite request for a supervisor, and Officer Kyle Brannon's response to that request, an open-handed strike unprovoked, unannounced, and followed immediately by a fabricated narrative delivered to the gathering crowd and subsequently filed in a sworn affidavit as an official police report. Judge Sims looked at the flash drive. He looked at Clarence's bruised face. He looked at Brannon in the gallery. The math was no longer working the way it had been working 30 minutes ago. Danielle Webb, Darius continued, was waiting outside the courtroom at this moment, accompanied by 2 federal marshals prepared to take the stand and swear under oath that the video was unaltered, raw footage captured on her personal device, time-stamped and geotagged with no post-production of any kind. Data. Patrick Coyle's career ambition was considerable, but it was not so considerable that it extended to planting himself in front of a federal evidence locomotive. He was looking at Brannon now, reading the man's face, and what he read there made his decision simple. The third strike arrived before Coyle could speak. Darius stated that he was the lead investigator of a federal civil rights probe that had been quietly building a case against the Central Precinct for 7 months, a probe that Officer Kyle Brannon, sitting in the second row in his ill-fitting gray suit, had been entirely unaware of, and had for the past 4 months been the primary named subject of. The silence in the courtroom was of a different quality than any silence before it. It was the silence of a room that has stopped processing and started absorbing. The fourth strike, quiet, final, and devastating, was the statement that the events of the previous afternoon had moved Brannon's federal indictment from next month to this afternoon. Gary Stoltz had now moved a full 6 inches away from Kyle Brannon and was examining something in the middle distance with focused attention. Patrick Coyle did not look at Judge Sims. He looked at Kyle Brannon in the second row, and in Brannon's face he saw the complete absence of any argument that was going to help either of them in this room. He stood up. "Your Honor," He said, his voice carrying only slightly less steadiness than usual in light of the newly presented circumstances. The state moves to dismiss all charges against Clarence Doyle with prejudice. Judge Sims brought his gavel down without hesitation. Case dismissed. Bailiff removed the restraints from Mr. Doyle. The bailiff moved toward the defense table with his keyring, and Darius stepped in front of him. "I'll do it," he said quietly. The bailiff handed over the keys without a word. Darius fit the key into the lock of his father's right cuff. The mechanism turned with a small, clean click. The left cuff followed. The chain fell to the defense table, and he put both keys on top of it, and then he looked at his father. And for one moment, and only one moment, the federal agent was entirely absent, and there was just a son standing next to Anne with a bruise on his face and a straight back and 72 years of endurance visible in the set of his shoulders and whatever passed between them. In that look was not something that needed to be witnessed by the room. "Are you all right, Dad?" Darius said, low enough that it was nearly private. "I am now, son," Clarence said. "Do what you have to do." Darius turned back to the courtroom. Darius Doyle stood at the defense table and said Kyle Brannan's name at normal conversational volume, and the room understood from the quality of those two words that what was about to happen had already in every meaningful sense happened, that the trajectory had been fixed the moment Brannan hit his lights on Jefferson Boulevard, and could not be altered by anything that occurred in this room now. Brannan sat in the second row and did not immediately move. He looked to his left at Gary Stoltz, who had been a union representative for 19 years, and who understood with complete clarity that the function of his office did not extend to federal civil rights violations, and that the best thing he could do at this moment for the union he represented was to ensure that his next action was not the thing that appeared in the newspaper tomorrow. Stoltz stood up. He took 2 careful, deliberate steps away from Kyle Brannan, not far. Not theatrical, just enough, and he said quietly and without particular emotion that the union didn't cover federal civil rights violations. That Brannan was on his own. The courtroom doors opened. 2 agents in plainclothes suits positioned themselves at the gallery entrance. Agent Rosa Delgado, compact and precise, and Agent James Pruitt, 6 feet even and entirely still, their jacket lapels pushed back enough to reveal the tactical holsters at their sides, hands loose at their hips. The posture of professionals who are present as a fact rather than as a threat. Kyle Brannan got to his feet. The swagger was gone with a completeness that was almost interesting to observe. It had not diminished or modified. It had simply ceased, as if it had only ever been a costume that the situation had required, and the situation had now changed its dress code. What replaced it was something smaller and considerably more honest, which was the trembling, exposed posture of a man who has built his entire sense of himself around the ability to dominate situations, and has encountered for the first time a situation that will not be dominated. Darius crossed the partition and read the federal charges clearly, and for the record deprivation of rights under color of law in violation of Title 18 United States Code Section 242. Filing a falsified police report used to unlawfully detain a United States citizen in violation of federal obstruction statutes, and further charges to be specified following the completion of the ongoing civil rights investigation into the Central Precinct. He crossed the remaining distance, took hold of Brannan's shoulder, turned him around, and pressed Brannan's wrists together behind his back before threading the cuffs through. There was no commentary. There was no narration of what was happening or why. The cuffs closed with a click that carried across the room with a clarity that several people in the gallery would describe later in various interviews and conversations as sounding like something final. "You have the right to remain silent," Darius said, his voice close to Brannan's ear, and carrying the absolute chill of someone who has been patient for a very long time. "I would strongly recommend that you use it." Agents Delgado and Pruitt took Brannan's arms and walked him toward the courtroom doors, and as they moved through the gallery, he turned his head once and looked back at the defense table. Clarence Doyle was standing in the front row, straight back, the purple bruise on his face catching the overhead light, his expression containing nothing that resembled pity or triumph, or any of the emotions that Brannan might have expected. He was simply watching with the same clear, level gaze that had looked at Brannon across a hot pavement on Jefferson Boulevard and seen exactly what was there. He did not look away. He did not offer Brannon the mercy of a reaction. Brannon was walked out of the courtroom, the doors closed behind him. The arrest of Kyle Brannon at 9:17 in the morning was not the end of anything. It was the moment the 7 months of quiet federal war finally became audible, the way a river that has been running underground eventually finds its way to the surface and is suddenly, obviously, undeniably there. Danielle Webb's video reached 2.1 million views by noon. By early evening, it was at 4.2 million and climbing, and the visual, a dignified elderly black man complying completely, being struck without provocation, and then the following morning watching his son place federal handcuffs on the man who had hit him, had been picked up by every major national network and was running on the continuous loop segment of every cable news program operating in the country. The story had the quality of stories that travel not because they are new, but because they are the articulation of something people already knew and had not yet seen, stated this clearly. Police Chief Ronald Hess held an emergency press conference at 2 in the afternoon, sweating under the camera lights with the specific desperation of a man whose department had been detonated in full public view and who needs to get ahead of the blast radius before it reaches him personally. He announced Brannon's immediate termination. Not administrative leave, not suspension pending review, but termination effective. Immediately badge destroyed, and stated that the department was cooperating fully with the federal investigation. The speed of the termination was in its own way a confession. The federal search warrants executed within hours, Brannon's locker at the precinct, his patrol vehicle, the suburban house he had shared with his wife until she had by that evening already begun consulting with a divorce attorney. The locker yielded 2 unregistered weapons, a throwaway revolver and a fixed blade knife, the hardware of a man who has planted evidence before and will plant it again, along with a burner phone, whose text message history, when extracted by the forensic team, contained material so comprehensively incriminating that the federal prosecutor assigned to the case read through it twice to make sure she was not misunderstanding something. She was not. Officer Cody Marsh, 29 years old, Brannon's partner of 14 months, watched the warrants land and made the decision that people in his position always have to make, eventually, whether to go down protecting someone who would not protect him in return, or to choose differently. He called Agent Rosa Delgado at 3:15 that afternoon and asked if there was a meeting available. There was. Marsh's recorded statement covered a prior incident from 8 months ago. A noise complaint call to an apartment building on Weston Street, a 23-year-old black man named Deshaun Carter, who had answered the door with a phone in his hand and no other provocation, and Kyle Brannon in the stairwell outside the apartment, deliberately and without pretext, breaking Carter's right wrist against the doorframe while Marsh watched and said nothing, and had been carrying the weight of that silence, he said, every day since. The statement transformed the case from a single assault into a pattern. Federal prosecutors now had what they needed to seek the maximum on every count. Brannon's fatal error came during his one permitted phone call from federal custody, which he used to relay through a contact he had used before. For various purposes, he had always assumed were untraceable. An offer of money to Danielle Webb, or rather to a person who might have access to Danielle Webb, to publicly claim that the video had been digitally altered, manufactured by AI, not real. He did not know that the FBI had been monitoring his communications under a FISA warrant for 6 weeks. He did not know that the call was recorded before he had finished making it. He would not learn these things until Darius Doyle walked into the interrogation room and set a folder on the metal table. The federal holding facility on Meridian Avenue was not a place designed to remind anyone of their former life. But Kyle Brannon, sitting in the interrogation room at a metal table bolted to the floor, was doing his best to remember it anyway. The uniform, the weight of the badge, the particular feeling of walking into a room and knowing that every other person in it was by the architecture of the situation subordinate. He had been in custody for 18 hours. He had not slept. His hair was unwashed. His skin had the sallow, papery quality of a man whose nervous system has been running at maximum output for an extended period and is beginning to show the cost. He had lost the suit somewhere in the processing. He was in facility-issued clothes now, and without the suit, and without the badge, and without the union representative who had walked away from him in a courtroom. What was left was considerably less than what had presented itself on Jefferson Boulevard the previous afternoon. Darius entered the room without hurry, set a manila folder on the table without opening it, and sat down across from Brannon in the unhurried manner of someone who has more time than the other person in the room and knows it. He looked at Brannon for a moment without speaking. Then he slid the transcript across the table. Brannon looked at it. It took him a moment to understand what he was reading, and the moment of understanding moved across his face in a sequence that was almost clinical to observe confusion. First, then the specific sick reorientation of a man realizing that the move he thought was private was documented in a government transcript in a federal holding facility. Witness tampering, Darius said. Obstruction of a federal proceeding. He named the additional charge and the additional years. He stated them without emphasis, the way you state facts. Brannon's response moved through its stages with a kind of exhausted inevitability. Denial, first thin and unconvincing even to the man producing it. Then minimization, the claim that he was just doing his job, that it was hard out there, that Darius didn't understand what it was like. Then, beneath the minimization, the appeal for understanding that was also underneath everything else a request for the mercy he had never in 14 months of working with Cody Marsh and 8 years on the force extended to anyone who asked him for it. Darius let him reach the end of it. Then he said quietly and without raising his voice what Brannon actually was not in the language of a charge sheet or a legal brief, but plainly a man who had found a position that came with a weapon and a shield, and had used both of them for years against people he had calculated could not effectively resist him. Who had chosen Clarence Doyle because Clarence looked alone and manageable and unlikely to have resources. Who had been wrong about that in every possible direction. He named the charges. He named Marsh's testimony. He named the Deshaun Carter incident. He named the drop weapons and the text messages and the intercepted phone call. He laid it out the way you lay out a proof, each element in its place, each one connected to the next, the total adding up to a number that Brannon's hands, when he heard it, could not seem to stop shaking. Darius picked up the folder and stood. He walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the frame, not for effect, but because there was one more thing that needed to be said, and this was the right moment for it. "My father has nothing to say to you," he said. "Some men don't earn the grace of even a message." He left. The door closed. The room held the sound of Brannon's breathing and nothing else. The thing about an act of cruelty is that it creates consequences in all directions, not just forward toward the person it was aimed at, but outward into the lives of everyone adjacent to it in ways that the person who committed it rarely has the imagination to anticipate. Deshaun Carter was 23 years old and had been living for 8 months with a surgical scar on his right wrist and a story that he had told to exactly 3 people: his mother, his best friend, and a public defender, who had listened and then explained carefully and with genuine regret why filing a complaint against the officer who had broken his wrist was unlikely to produce any outcome worth the ordeal it would require. He saw Danielle Webb's video on his phone at 10:15 in the evening, and he recognized the name Brannon immediately, and he called the FBI tip line at 10:47 and said so. By the following morning, he had a meeting with Agent Delgado. By the following week, he had a lawyer and a civil case, and more importantly, the first real confirmation he had received since it happened that what had been done to him was going to be acknowledged. The federal probe expanded outward from Brannon like a stress fracture moving through glass, following the established lines of connection, following the text messages and the relationships and the informal networks of mutual protection that had allowed things like the Deshaun Carter incident and things considerably worse to be absorbed and neutralized by the department's internal review process for years. 5 additional officers were indicted on federal racketeering and civil rights charges. Chief Ronald Hess, unable to survive the consent decree negotiations and the public testimony and the avalanche of victims who had suddenly somewhere to take their stories, was forced into retirement under conditions that the city's communications office described as voluntary and that were not. The city entered a federal oversight agreement, Independent body cameras with mandatory audit trails, a civilian review board equipped with actual subpoena power, use of force protocols rewritten under federal supervision. It would not fix everything. It was not designed to fix everything. It was designed to make certain specific behaviors considerably more expensive and considerably more difficult to hide, and in that narrower ambition it had a reasonable chance of succeeding. Cody Marsh received a reduced sentence and a permanent bar from law enforcement. He was not a hero, and the federal prosecutor who negotiated his plea deal was explicit about that in her closing statement. He had watched a man's wrist get broken and said nothing for 8 months, and the fact that he eventually told the truth did not transform the months of silence into something other than what they were. He chose the truth when it still cost him something real. That was noted. It was not celebrated. Yvonne Castillo, the public defender who had nearly talked Clarence Doyle into a guilty plea, filed a transfer request to the Civil Rights Litigation Unit of the Public Defender's Office 3 weeks after the sentencing. In her application, she cited the Doyle case by name. She was transferred within the month. Federal Judge Diana Reeves, 58, had been on the federal bench for 14 years and had developed in that time the specific exacting clarity of someone who has seen a great deal of human behavior at its least defensible and has responded by becoming entirely immune to the arguments that people make when they want consequences to be smaller than their actions. She presided over the sentencing of Kyle Brannon on a Thursday morning in October, with the same expression she brought to every proceeding, attentive, precise, completely without theater. The gallery was full civil rights advocates, journalists, and what appeared to be a substantial cross-section of the city's residents who had over the years had their own encounters with the central precinct and had never previously had a room to sit in while those encounters were officially addressed. They filled every available bench, and when the room was settled and quiet, the weight of their collective presence was something that could be felt as a physical thing. In the front row, Clarence Doyle in a navy suit sitting straight, his wrists bearing faint discoloration that had mostly faded over the months since the arraignment. Darius beside him, his federal badge clipped to his belt, his hands resting quietly on his knees. 2 seats down, Danielle Webb, who had recently passed her pre-nursing admissions exam and was still mildly stunned by the trajectory her Wednesday morning decision to start filming had set in motion. Beside her, Deshaun Carter, with his right wrist resting on the arm of the bench, the surgical scar visible below his shirt sleeve, his mother sitting next to him with her hand over his. Kyle Brannon at the defense table wore a khaki federal jumpsuit and the physical evidence of 9 months in custody. 30 pounds, lighter gray, coming in at his temples, his face carrying the hollowed, careful quality of a man who has been stripped of every external source of his sense of himself and has found in the absence of those things that there is not as much underneath as he had assumed. The permanent smirk was gone as if it had never been there. His public defender, the union, having withdrawn its support when the federal charges were formalized, and the private attorneys having withdrawn when the money dried up, made the standard argument, prior years of service, a broken man, the mandatory minimum. Judge Reeves listened to the argument without expression and declined it without extensive comment. His service, she said, had been a reign of terror wearing a uniform. What he had lost was not mitigation, it was consequence. The court recognizes Mr. Clarence Doyle for a victim impact statement. Clarence rose. The arthritis was visible in the way he gathered himself to stand, the slight pause at the bottom, the deliberate care with which he straightened. But once he was standing, he was entirely upright, entirely present, and he walked to the podium with the same unhurried, dignified pace that had carried him through a holding cell and an arraignment and the complete machinery of a system that had been briefly but completely leveled against him. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and looked at Kyle Brannon, and he said quietly that he needed Brannon to look at him. It took Brannon a long moment to comply. His eyes had been fixed on the table on the distance, on anything that was not the face of the man he had hit, but eventually, agonizingly, he raised his head. Clarence spoke without notes. He did not shout, and he did not weep, and he did not perform anything. He told Brannon what Brannon had seen on Jefferson Boulevard, and what Brannon had missed, that what was standing on that pavement in a pressed linen shirt was not a target, was not an inconvenience, was not a symbol of something Brannon resented, but a man who had carried the mail for 34 years and paid taxes in this city since before Brannon was born, and raised a family and served his church and tended a community garden and done every single day of his adult life the kind of quiet, unglamorous, essential work that cities are actually built on. He told Brannon about the habit at 10 and 2. He said he had been doing it since 1971. He said he had taught his son to do it when Darius was 9 years old, had sat in the car with him and explained the arithmetic of it. The specific, unfair, real arithmetic of moving through a world where a man who looks like them has to prove his harmlessness before he is permitted to be harmless. He said he had taught that lesson not in bitterness but as a fact. The same way you taught a child about weather or traffic, here is how things are. Here is how you survive them with your dignity intact. He paused. He looked at Brannon for a moment without speaking. He said he did not hate this man. That hate was a weight he refused to carry for someone who had not earned even that much of his emotional energy. But he demanded accountability, not for himself alone, not for the sake of his own injury, but for every person in this city and every city like it who had been taken apart by a badge and a fabricated report and had no son with a federal credential to walk through the courtroom doors. For all the people whose cases had never reached a courtroom because the machinery had simply absorbed them and moved on. The arc of the moral universe is long, he said, but it bends. This morning, it bent a little further. He walked back to his seat. Darius put his hand on his father's shoulder. The room was completely still for several seconds, not the silence of discomfort, but the silence of something that has just been said, that a room needs a moment to fully receive. Judge Reeves looked at Kyle Brannon for a long time before she spoke. Then she told him what he had done with the trust that had been placed in him, and she sentenced him to 324 months in a federal correctional facility, 27 years without the possibility of parole. Permanent bar from law enforcement, security, or public office in any capacity. Full forfeiture of his pension. Upon release, 10 years of supervised probation. The gavel came down. Brannon's knees buckled. The marshals caught him under the arms and held him upright, and as they walked him toward the side door of the courtroom, he turned his head and looked back one final time at the man he had hit on Jefferson Boulevard. Clarence was already turned away, speaking quietly to his son. He did not look up. He did not offer Brannon a final glance or a final expression or any of the things that Brannon might have used to measure himself against in the years ahead. He simply wasn't looking. Kyle Brannon was transferred to a federal correctional facility in the northwestern part of the state assigned to protective custody, the standard arrangement for former law enforcement in general population, motivated not by concern for their comfort, but by the institution's interest in maintaining operational order. The isolation that came with that arrangement, the particular silence of days spent entirely removed from the social architecture of a world he had spent 8 years dominating, was something that no one who knew him would have predicted he would find so difficult to survive. His wife had filed for divorce before the sentencing. The house entered foreclosure within the year. There was nothing left of the life he had built on other people's fear, except the memory of it, and the memory did not keep him warm. A certified letter arrived at Danielle Webb's apartment 3 weeks after the sentencing from a legal trust, whose name she had to look up and could not find in any accessible registry. The letter contained a single document and a handwritten note. The document was a payoff confirmation from her nursing school's financial office, $54,000 in student loan debt cleared in full. The note said only the world needs people who don't look away. She never found out it came from the Doyle family's portion of the civil settlement the city had paid, without admitting liability, because some gifts are cleaner when they are anonymous. Deshaun Carter settled his civil case against the city for $1.2 million, a number that his attorney described as appropriate, and that Deshaun described in a brief statement to a reporter outside the federal courthouse as less important than the other thing. The part where he stood in a federal courtroom and told the truth under oath, and a federal judge wrote it into the official record and it stayed there. That he said was the part that mattered. The money was practical. The record was permanent. Darius Doyle was promoted to Deputy Assistant Director of the FBI's Civil Rights Division and relocated to Washington, D.C., where he spent the next several years building a national training program for identifying and addressing entrenched patterns of departmental abuse, not theory but operational methodology, built on the real architecture of real cases, including the one that had begun with a phone call at 11:17 on a Tuesday night and 4 hours of driving through the dark. He kept one photograph on his desk in his Washington office, Clarence in the community garden, hands in the soil, not looking at the camera, the morning light on his face. The city, under federal oversight, saw use of force complaints fall 61% in the first 18 months. It was not a solved problem. It was a changed landscape, and changed landscapes are where different things become possible. It was a Tuesday morning in late April, 8 months after the sentencing, and the jasmine that ran along the south fence of the Clement Street Community Garden was in full bloom. Not the tentative exploratory bloom of early spring, but the confident, generous bloom of a plant that has established itself and is doing exactly what it was designed to do. Clarence Doyle was on his knees in the third row, tending the roses he had been growing in this garden for 3 years, his new wire-rimmed glasses sitting straight on his face, the ones Darius had bought him quietly without ceremony as a replacement for the pair that had skittered across the hot pavement on Jefferson Boulevard, and that Clarence had never retrieved because some things are worth leaving where they fell. His arthritic knees ached on the soil, the way they always ached, and he worked alongside the ache, the way he worked alongside everything that the years had placed in his body, not ignoring it, not performing indifference to it, just incorporating it into the rhythm of the work and moving forward. The roses were a deep, saturated red, the color of something that has been tended long enough to become exactly what it was always going to be. He pruned with the patient, deliberate care of someone who understands that gardening is a negotiation between your intentions and the plant's own sense of its requirements, and that the gardener who listens more than they direct generally ends up with better roses. The footsteps on the sidewalk registered. Before he looked up the particular cadence of a patrol officer, unhurried the equipment on the belt, creating its familiar small percussion against the fabric of the uniform. He did not tense. He did not calculate. He simply finished the cut he was making, and then sat back on his heels and waited. The officer was young, mid-20s, part of the post-consent decree hiring class, with the careful, attentive posture of someone who had been trained differently than his predecessors and was actively working to embody the training. He stopped at the low fence of the garden and looked at the roses with what appeared to be genuine appreciation. He tipped his hat. "Good morning, sir," he said. "Those are beautiful." Clarence wiped the soil from his hands with the cloth he kept in his back pocket, straightened up with the care that his knees required, and looked at the young officer with the same clear, level gaze that had looked at Kyle Brannon across a hot pavement. The same eyes, the same face carrying now what they had always carried underneath. Not hardness, but depth. Not armor, but knowledge. Not the exhaustion of a man who has been beaten down, but the settled, unassuming peace of a man who has outlasted everything that tried to diminish him. He offered the officer a quiet, genuine smile. "Yes, they are," he said. "It just takes time and knowing which things need to be pulled out." The officer nodded, smiled back, and continued his patrol down Clement Street, the morning moving around him the way mornings do in cities, with the ordinary, unhurried abundance of a day that has not yet decided what it will become. Clarence watched him go. Then he turned back to his roses, pressed both hands into the warm soil, and resumed the work. Unhurried, deliberate, completely at home in the city, he had served his entire life on a morning that belonged entirely to him. Here is the thing that Clarence Doyle's story makes impossible to look away from. He was worth protecting before his son walked through those courtroom doors. He was worth the law's full protection at 10 and 2 on Jefferson Boulevard, when he was just a 72-year-old man in a pressed linen shirt on his way to pick up his prescription. The tragedy at the center of this story is not that Kyle Brannon hit him. It is that the system moved to correct it only because of the federal badge that happened to be in his son's pocket. Every person in that courtroom without a badge deserved the same outcome. Most of them are still waiting for it. That is not a footnote to this story, that is the story and the work of building the world where Clarence's dignity is protected. Not because of who his son is, but because of who Clarence is, that work is the thing that matters and it is not finished. But here is what Brannon could never take from him, and what no version of that afternoon could have taken from him: the choice Clarence made every single morning of his adult life to meet the world's worst with the best of himself. If you have ever been talked down to, dismissed, underestimated, or made to feel like you did not belong somewhere you had every right to be, and if you are watching this, there is a very good chance you have, then you understand something about what Clarence was carrying on that sidewalk that is not in any police report or any federal indictment. You understand that keeping your dignity when someone is trying to take it from you is not a passive act. It is, in fact, the hardest and most powerful thing a person can do. Your dignity doesn't require anyone's permission. It doesn't disappear because someone with a title decides to disrespect it. Clarence knew that at 9 years old, and at 22, and at 72, and the man who tried to take it from him is going to have 27 years to think about how completely he failed. We wanted to hear from you. Tell us in the comments about a moment in your life when you held your ground against something that tried to break you, when you chose dignity over reaction and found out later that the choice was the right one. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to read today. And if stories like this one, stories about justice, about the lengthy patience of truth, about the people who refuse to stay quiet, if those are the stories you come here for, then subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications, because we are building something here and we are just getting started.